Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us today. My name is Katie Highland, and I am the Director of Affiliated Societies here at GHA. On behalf of GHA and the Georgia Society for Healthcare Materials Management Society, we just want to thank you for signing up for our virtual conference. This has been quite the year, but we are excited that we were able to provide this chance for y'all to get together and network and get some education. A few Zoom etiquette notes just before we get started. If you could make sure that your mic is muted and that it remains muted for the duration of the sessions. We do have a pretty large group today, so we will have opportunities for questions. You can utilize the chat feature for that at the bottom of your screen. Dr. Bradley, who is our first speaker, has said that you're welcome to ask questions during the session if you have them. If you could just address those to everyone in the chat feature, Ryan or myself will be happy to read those out to him. We are recording this session, and we will be happy to send this out as well as the PDF version of the presentations and a survey following the session, and we will do the same thing with tomorrow's. So I think at this time, I will pass it over to Dennis Reed, our GSHMM chair for the year.
Thank you, Katie. Well, good morning, everyone. We appreciate everyone's participation. I think this is probably our first virtual conference with GSHMM. It's been kind of a crazy year with the COVID, not being able to meet in person. We felt like this was a good opportunity to still provide some education with some really dynamic speakers, and we hope everyone enjoys today and tomorrow's sessions. We want to also thank our sponsors. We've got some presenting sponsors that really help make this possible. Cintas is one, Owens & Minor, Ronstadt, and True D. Their participation is greatly appreciated. And as a result of their sponsorships, the board has decided that we will be able to offer all of the current GSHM members a complimentary dues for 2021. We felt like that was really important given the challenges that all of our hospitals are up against with the COVID, having to purchase PPEs and a lot of other items that they're spending money on that they may not have spent otherwise. So we feel like this will be a help for all of those healthcare systems. This is our conference that, again, it's virtual. It's 2 days, today and tomorrow. So if you haven't signed up for tomorrow, we would appreciate you doing that. And not to further ado any time, Dr. Bradley will be our first speaker. He's spoken before at GSHMM a number of times, as well as ARM. If you've had a chance to listen to him, he's a dynamic speaker. We really appreciate his participation. He's Associate Professor of Information Systems and Supply Chain in the Haslam College of Business at the University of Tennessee. And so, Dr. Bradley, thank you, and you can take this moment now.
Thank you, Dennis, and thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to be with you and the team of GSHMM. I really missed the fact that I couldn't be with you in person last year, but I'm so grateful that you guys came back around and gave me an opportunity to share with you this year. I always say that GSHMM is my unofficial ARM chapter. It's my unofficial home. I don't know if the state of Tennessee likes that, but it is what it is. And so we'll just keep moving forward here. So what I want to talk to you about today is what I call the invisible chink in supply chain's armor. And so what I mean by that is there are some aspects of supply chain, some points of vulnerability that oftentimes we are unaware of what they are. We are unaware of how they manifest. But I believe as supply chain professionals, it's going to be vitally important for us to do this, or for us to understand that. Supply chain is going to be vital to the success of every healthcare organization moving forward. If nothing else, the COVID-19 pandemic has definitely demonstrated that. The learning outcomes for this particular session are on the screen, and we will provide these slides to you after the fact, so you will have those as well. But a couple of points that I want to highlight here is we're going to talk about, what are the different types of data strategies that I'm seeing organizations undertake? But then most importantly, what are the different data domains that supply chain entities, particularly in healthcare, are needing to utilize. And so we'll talk about the ones that are currently being used. We'll talk about the areas of data that we don't really think a lot about, but yet are extremely pertinent. And then I'll show you from the perspective of the adoption pyramid from a technology standpoint, how I believe we give a little too much credence to advanced analytics before we build the necessary infrastructure to make sure that we can take advantage of it. And so here we are now at what I call the chasm, where we have this bridge that's going to connect us between this pre and current COVID world, and then what things are going to look like once we're farther down the road and COVID isn't necessarily the primary pandemic that's attracting our focus. And so we have to be mindful that as we make decisions now, these decisions are really going to determine what our post-COVID supply chain and supply chain capabilities look like. And if one thing that we have found out with respect to COVID-19 is that our supply chains are extremely fragile. You know, I consistently tell organizations and executives that I work with is we thought we were doing the right things by having longer, leaner supply chains from a cost efficiency standpoint. But what we also did, we made those supply chains thinner. And what it meant is that they were not necessarily designed to be robust and to be able to withstand situations that we have seen manifest as a result of COVID. However, the positive side of this is what I have seen is that our supply chain professionals, particularly those in healthcare delivery organizations, have demonstrated and proven time and time again, not only are they innovative, but they are extremely resilient. And so my hat is off to those of you who actually played a vital role into helping your organizations continue to provide the high quality care that your patients need, and under dire situations and under really many types of constraints that you may not have necessarily even thought would have been possible. So I want to take you to something that I have said over and over and over many times, which is when we talk about supply chain, we typically talk about these 4 elements of visibility, integrity, transparency, and traceability. And we talk about them as if they are the Holy Grail. And one of the things I have consistently for years been cautioning supply chain leaders is that if you put too much attention and focus on those things, you're not going to get to where you need to be. Where we need to be focused on is really ensuring that we have a supply network or a supply infrastructure that is sustainable. And I'm not necessarily talking about sustainability from an eco-friendly standpoint, although there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. What I'm saying is you have a supply chain that will outlast the current leaders, will outlast their successors, and will actually give you enduring capability so that as the market dynamics change, as patients' needs change, and as environmental and social events dictate, your supply chain is agile, it's adaptable, and responsive to those changes. And so having said that, what we have to do, we have to view transparency, visibility, and traceability as pillars. They are what I consider to be the means to the ends and not the ends. The goal has to be a sustainable supply chain. The other thing that COVID-19 has truly illuminated is the fact that supply chain risk management, although we gave a lot of lip service to it, we weren't doing a good job of it. In fact, the way we were thinking about risk, it probably wasn't necessarily on par with the way we needed to be thinking about supply chain risk management. And just last night, I was finishing up a blog for a strategic marketplace initiative, which actually comes back and taps into this whole concept of this. You may have heard that many believe that as a result of COVID and as a result of tremendous increase in virtual care and remote care services being brought online to deal with the fact that we couldn't perform elective procedures and the fact that many patients are not necessarily as interested in coming to our facilities to receive care, there is now this notion and this belief that the next epidemic, not pandemic, but the next epidemic is going to be one pertaining to data breaches and HIPAA violations. And so when you think about this, the whole concept and the notion of supply chain risk management is going to be extremely vital, because those risk mitigation mechanisms that you put in place are risk mitigation mechanisms that actually translate to the rest of the organization. And why do I say that? What we have seen over the past year is that the primary targets for data breaches and entry points into healthcare facilities are by way of the supply chain. Yes, so breaches are happening because hackers are becoming much more intuitive, and what they're doing, they're looking upstream. And what they're saying is, who are your suppliers? Who are your vendors? who are your partners, and what does their cyber hygiene look like? And they try to identify the weakest link in your supply network, and then they use that weakest link to make their way into your organization. And so as a result of this, we now have to figure out how to move forward in this new era. And so there used to be this adage that information is power. And I believe it's true. I believe it's still relevant. I believe it's still valuable to have this particular point of view. However, the shift that we have to make now is that we have to think about insight is empowerment. Information power is still going to be there, but I need to now empower individuals at various areas in my organization, regardless of their rank within the supply chain function. I need to give them the insights they need and at a level that they can understand so that they can then be mobilized to make decisions. If one thing COVID-19 has demonstrated is decisions have to be made relatively quickly, and we have to make it with very limited information. Sometimes we're right, sometimes we're wrong, but regardless, we have to do it in such a way that we can pivot. So let's jump to one of the major issues here. I call this the good and the bad. The good thing that I have seen in healthcare supply chain organizations from a procurement standpoint is that many have begun to move into what we start to say using leading practices of ensuring that you have multiple sources. And I know you're going to have a great session coming after this here with our colleagues from Grady who are in the talk about supplier diversity, and they will begin to talk to you about the importance of not only ensuring that your supplier base is diverse in terms of size and ownership, but also ensuring that you're spreading the wealth around in terms of where you're sourcing your materials from. And so if you look at this particular graphic, what it's demonstrating is, yes, we do have multiple sourcing opportunities in healthcare, and many are taking advantage of it. However, what COVID-19 illuminated, which some of us knew, but not all of us knew, is that there was a bad to this. And the bad was this: because of the lack of upstream visibility and because of the unwillingness of many of our suppliers and even our distributors to be transparent about their practices, what we failed to realize is that those multiple sources all had a single point of origin. So whether we were talking about N95s and trying to source those, and when we break that down into the 5 or 6 components that make up, you begin to realize that there is a one primary provider of each one of those components, and it happens to be residential in a particular, residing in a particular country, which happened to be one of the countries that was first hit by COVID-19. Therefore, we couldn't get what we needed. So then we have to start looking for equivalent products. And then what we began to realize is that our Rolodex, so to speak, was relatively thin in terms of which entities could we go to source that were actually pulling these items from a totally different point of origin to ensure that we could then get it. And so what this leads me to is the question of, is there really a chink, a crack in or vulnerability in our supply chain armor? And if it is, what is it? And I believe it's data. And what I mean by that is oftentimes we hear people talking about data is an asset, or data is the new oil, or data is the new gold. And I always say, but we perceive it as an asset, but it's still a liability. And the reason I say it's a liability is because everything that we talk about around data, which is how much it's going to cost to capture it, how much it's going to cost to process it, how much it's going to cost to integrate it, and then how much we have to invest in infrastructure to ensure we can analyze it in a manner that we need to in order to make the appropriate decisions. That doesn't sound like an asset. That sounds like a liability. That sounds like something that costs me, not necessarily something to where the benefits outweigh the necessary costs. And so I love these Dilbert cartoons. And so let's take this one here from left to right, where you see this question being posed of what does the data tell us to do? And as Dilbert, yes, was there a question?
Excuse me for interrupting, but we're not seeing your slide.
Are you not? How about now?
Yes, we can see them now.
My apologies about that there. So you missed some beautiful slides, man, like this one. So this is the one that I was talking about, how we have the multiple sources. So we get into multi-sourcing, but we have a single point of origin. And that was the graphic that I was referring to. So whether it is various forms of PPE, or whether they're supplies and materials that aren't necessarily PPE of nature, the reality is much of what we source, even if you look at the pharmaceuticals that you're dispensing in your organization, particularly if you think about the generics, it is a well-known fact that approximately 80 to 85% of the world generics rely on what we call APIs, the active pharmaceutical ingredient, which primarily come from Southeast Asia and mainly from one country. So what happens when there is a natural disaster, or more so when there is a pandemic of some kind, and all of a sudden we begin to see disruptions like we never thought possible? And so then that brought me to this point here about the chink in our supply chain armor. And then this is the Dilbert cartoon that I was referring to here, where the question is posed about, does the data tell us what to do? And Dilbert responds, we only have bad data on this. And then the next question is, does the bad data suggest we do what we wanted to do anyway? And the response is yes. And then as an executive says here, that's called good data. And this is what I mean in so many organizations. We're using the data not to really inform us. We're using the data to corroborate what we already believe, not to the point to where it was an intelligent choice, but it's really more what we rely on as a gut feeling and a gut instinct. And that creates challenges for so many healthcare organizations, particularly in a supply chain. And so even when you're relying on third parties to give you valuable data about what are contracts looking like in your particular area for similar goods, or if we're relying on them to help us to understand what are our options, what are equivalent products, what they're oftentimes aren't telling us when they help us identify equivalent products is, what's the likelihood that I'm going to be able to get it? What's the risk profile associated with that particular material or supply that I'm trying to bring into my organization? And when you walk through the hallways, how many times have you looked at all of your colleagues wearing supposedly credible masks, and have you ever stopped to wonder, is my level of protection the same as theirs? Or is their level of protection the same as mine? Because we recognize that all those masks that we're wearing don't necessarily come from the same manufacturer. They don't necessarily come from the same source. And so this whole semblance of equivalency is really very subjective to a degree. And so that brings me to this point about, how do you prioritize? So many organizations, what I see now, are enamored with artificial intelligence and advanced analytics. And I get it. And I understand that. But what we've got to do, we've got to ensure that at the base of the pyramid, things are solid. What is the level of digital connectivity across the organization? Are we truly able to tie our MMIS, our Materials Management Information Systems, and our ERPs, Enterprise Resource Planning Solutions, are we able to tie those into our clinical systems, whether it's the radiology systems, our laboratory information systems, our electronic health record solutions? Are we able to tie these things together such that we not only know what we have, but we can accurately project our burn rate, because we understand what's being utilized, who's utilizing it, in what cases they're utilizing it, so that we have better visibility across the organization? Because those projections that we want to do in terms of how much, I was looking yesterday and talking with someone, and they were saying, you know, we've got these fancy models that we use to help us to project what we're going to need from a PPE standpoint if we have patient volumes increased by a certain percentage. And I didn't bring this up during that conversation, but I often wonder, okay, great, you got a great model, but what's feeding it? How are you pushing the data to those models? Because from what I've seen, many organizations have very static models with a set of data variables or elements that they're looking at, but yet it's not changing over time. So as situations and circumstances changing, your models aren't evolving. So what might be a truthful result today could really be a misleading result next week. And that's why it's important to ensure that we have the digital connectivity built in, so that we can harness the data from these valuable streams, then begin to automate the flow of data, so that we can then inform the analytics models that we're going to begin to rely on to help us make real-time decisions. And so that leads me to this. Organizations have to have a data strategy. Your data strategy is not the same as your analytic strategy. It is not the same as your digital strategy, and it is not the same as your business strategy. So when I talk about a data strategy, what I'm talking about is that you have a set of principles, a set of things that are going to guide your organization. And these principles are integrated. They are not just one-off and independent of one another. They're related to one another. And what those principles are going to do is they're going to guide you with respect to what are the desired behaviors around the way we utilize data, the way we access data, and then what would be appropriate decision-making mechanisms or approaches that we can make relative to the data that's available to us. And then the key piece here, we have to include governance as well as management of the data, but not the data at a single point in time, but across the full spectrum, across the full life cycle of the data. So from the point that data originates to the point that data is transformed and takes on a totally different look and feel, to where the data connotes something other than what it previously connoted, even to the point where we decide to retire or archive the data. That's what we mean by managing the full life cycle. And your data strategy is going to inform how your organization is going to do that. And it's not relegated to your internal practices. It also informs you with respect to how you work with third parties, such as ECRI and the data they provide, or how you work with data that's provided by your GPOs and so forth. And so then we say, well, what are some of the key aspects of data, Randy, that we have to be mindful of from a strategy? One, you got to make sure you have multi-level alignment. Remember, I talked about the digital strategy, the analytic strategy, and the business strategy being distinct. But yet you have to ensure that your data strategy is going to be in harmony with these. One, it has to ensure that whatever organizational direction you're trying to move in, your data strategy is going to be paramount and important in terms of ensuring that you achieve that. And so your analytic strategy is going to be based on your data strategy, and then your digital strategy is really going to provide the means to ensure that you're able to capitalize on your analytics and data strategy and bring those things to fruition. And so we say, well, man, there are a lot of strategies. Absolutely. And the problem I've seen with so many organizations I work with around the globe is that we didn't know this. We knew about a business strategy. We're beginning to hear about analytic strategy, and then data strategy was just like, you've blown my mind. We're not even thinking about that yet. And so then you say, well, what else needs to happen, Randy? You've got to make sure that your data strategy is inspired by the capabilities you have, or the capabilities that are readily available in the marketplace. I see some organizations say, we're going to build a strategy around things that have yet to be created. And I say, that's not a strategy, that's a pipe dream, because you can't build a plan of execution around a strategy that's focused on something that does not exist. And so sometimes we get a bit too pie in the sky, a bit too blue ocean with respect to these, and then it does not manifest in what we need to manifest. Then there's the focus on ensuring that we know how to utilize the assets. You'll see now I'm making sure that we position data as a value add across the organization, and particularly in the supply chain, so that we know what we have access to, we know who owns it, and we know what our plans are to acquire, as well as leverage both internal and external data. And what I am seeing now with the companies we're working with, both in healthcare and outside of healthcare, is that they are struggling to figure out what are those data sources we should be focused on that are going to help us make more credible and trustworthy decisions. And then the most important, I think, of all of these points is one we don't talk about. And I say you have to focus on proprietary data. What do I mean by proprietary data? Proprietary data is not data that relies on your intellectual property. It's not that. It's not data that you would give away that was going to affect your competitive edge or competitive position in the marketplace. Proprietary data means it's data that you have access to, or data that you own that no one else has or no one else can get. So there are times, when I look at some of the work that I do, I get access to data and it's like, great, no one else has access to this. So that data is proprietary to me because no one else has access to it. And so when we begin to take a catalog of what data assets we have in our organizations, what we're finding is many organizations are beginning to realize that the gold mine was already there while we were in some other field trying to find those things that we thought were actually going to be of value. So if we move on, here's the challenge that I see organizations run into around this whole thing as data as the chink in their supply chain armor. If you remember I said you need to align these with your analytics and your digital strategy. The problem is most organizations don't have them. If you look here, this is nearly 750 organizations that I have worked with. And what I find is fewer than 20% of them have an analytic strategy. And then when you look at those who have a digital strategy, approximately 500 organizations I work with, just a little over a quarter of them have a digital strategy. Now, here's the problem. When I look at that fewer than 20% that have an analytics strategy, more than 80% of them have analytics initiatives underway. Many of them even have an analytics function. Sometimes that function even sits within supply chain. And then you have the digital side. 90% of these organizations, although they don't have a digital strategy, they have digital initiatives. And I always say, if you have initiatives and no strategy, how will you know success? How will you measure success? How will you know when directionally you're moving in the right area? So the sparseness of the complementary strategies also become problematic. And this is why oftentimes that chink in our armor is relatively invisible, because we're watching these two things and not realizing the one thing that is going to help inform these two is where we should have started. But we weren't focused there. We were focused here. And so you say, well, percentage-wise, Randy, it looks like more organizations have a digital strategy. It looks like that from a percentage standpoint, but if you look at the raw data, there are actually not that many different organizations in terms of the ones that actually have an analytics and the ones that have a digital. So it's not to where they're favoring one over the other. We are just extremely poor across all fronts. And let me tell you, this data is spanning multiple industries. I know we oftentimes say that healthcare lags behind other industries from both a technology standpoint and from a supply chain practice standpoint, but this is one of those situations where we're about average with everyone else. We're not necessarily lagging. We're looking just like them. Organizations haven't figured this out. And just recently, I was talking with a large pharmaceutical company who has started, they've got a digital team and they've got an analytics team, and both of them reside in the supply chain function, and they inform what happens at the organizational level. So we're beginning to see this. And even when you start thinking about vaccine distribution, both of these, as well as the data strategy, are going to come into play. And the organizations that begin to master this are the ones who are going to be much more successful and get greater traction and being able to distribute vaccines on a regular basis. Let's take a step back and think about what we've seen in the news recently. So just towards the end of last week, we saw the announcement where Pfizer came out and said now that they're only going to be able to provide 50% of the vaccines that they thought they were going to be able to present before the end of the year. And when you look at, well, why is that? And if you read the headlines, and if you just trusted the headlines made it seem as if Pfizer's supply chain was broken. But that wasn't the reality. What was happening in reality is the late decision to approve the vaccine then created a situation in which Pfizer now has to go to all of their provider suppliers of raw materials or for the APIs that they need to manufacture the vaccine, and finding out now that those suppliers can't spin things up fast enough to be able to ensure that even though Pfizer has the manufacturing and the production capacity to produce the vaccine, you can't get the raw materials that you need in a timely manner. And so that is the challenge. And so when you talk about the lack of transparency on the part of suppliers, the lack of visibility that we have at an organizational level, now we begin to see where and how data becomes that major vulnerability in many of our supply chains, and is not just relegated to those organizations that provide and deliver healthcare services. So, well, Randy, when you talk about this data strategy, you mentioned the governance piece. What are some of those data governance components that are actually part of it? Well, there are at least four main areas. You got the policy, the process, the procedures, and then you have the ownership. And if you look at the policy here, this is the key piece here that I find in many organizations, where having the ability to identify what are our data domains. And so what we mean by that is what are the various types or categories of data that we have across the organization. And then when we get to the supply chain, you're not absent here. You have supplier data, you have product data, you have utilization data. And then when we begin to look broader than that, you look at those, some of you in your organizations, you may be responsible for managing your blood supply chain, and some of you may not. Some of you may be responsible for procuring pharmaceuticals, and yet some of you may not. But at the same time, they also have suppliers. And because we never really thought about the supplier data as a specific category or domain, we don't necessarily share information. So where there are potential for economies of scale and better pricing models, if we were to share data across the various functions that are utilizing the same vendors or suppliers, we're not doing that. because we were not necessarily categorizing data at the appropriate level. Then the ethical use of data. We all know from a PHI standpoint and from a HIPAA standpoint that we should not disclose data about patients and patients' care that unless we give it to a medical provider, and that medical provider is one who is involved in the care. But that's only one aspect, and that's not even ethical, that's more legal. But what happens when you have an individual in your organization who sets up a company outside of the entity utilizing your supplier data, utilize your material data, and then even more so utilizing your patient data as a way to monetize and support their business opportunities? And I'm just not making this up. I actually had a client where this was an issue they had in their organization. And then we had to go back, and what we found out is the data policy never spoke to it. So the person was not doing anything illegal. Was it ethical? It was sketchy, but there was no policy that spoke to it. There was nothing that prohibited this type of behavior. And so then now you got to go back and you got to address your policies and realize that they need to be more granular. Then once you have the policy, what are the procedures? What are the norms you're going to put in place of how you're going to assemble data? How are you going to ensure the integrity and the consistency of the data that you're making, that you're using to make decisions? And then what are the processes that you're going to put in place about how to access? How do you handle requests for data across the organization? Or how do you handle the storage and the archival and the retrieval of that data, and then the security of it? So all of these are things that we take for granted that are there. But if anything, when you look at the breaches, in fact, what some of you should have received, I would say maybe 3 to 3.5 weeks ago, there should have been a notice that came out from HHS, the Department of Homeland Security, as well as the FBI, where they talked about there was an incredible and imminent threat against healthcare organizations in the US about potential data breaches. Now, many of you should have received that notice because it came out from AHA, and then it came out across most of the news wires. Well, let me tell you kind of the rest of that story. In less than 24 hours after that announcement hit the news wire, there was a hospital in Vermont that was actually hit. And as of 2 weeks ago, that hospital was still crippled because of a data breach. And they're not the only ones. In fact, when you also look at, and we've always known that data breaches could potentially compromise care, we know of a fact that in September of this year, there was a hospital in Dusseldorf, Germany, that had a data breach. And as a result of a data breach, patients who were there who needed urgent and emergency care could not get it because the facility could not access the relevant data they needed to determine what type of care to deliver. So in a process, in an attempt to divert these patients to a different facility, the patient died. It is credited as the first known case worldwide in which a patient has expired that we can relate that to a data breach. Was this something that if care could have been rendered, this patient would have survived? Absolutely. Was the primary reason in which care could not be delivered a result of the data breach? Absolutely. But I'm going to let you in on a little secret. We say that's the first one. That's not the first one. That's just the first one we know of. In fact, I know of another incident in the US that happened even before that in the same year, this year, where a facility, by way of a data breach and the inability to access their backup data, and inability to restore the data, inability to utilize the systems, even when you move to your manual processes, we all know it's not the same. There was not just one person who expired, but several patients who expired. That never made the news. And so what I'm telling you guys is data truly is the invisible chink, not only in our supply chain armor, but even when it comes to the resiliency or the lack thereof of our healthcare delivery organizations. I'm going to pause here because I've covered a lot and I haven't been monitoring the chat window to see if there's anything, but I'm going to pause to see, do we have any questions or comments that you all would like to make? Because we got time to get through the rest, but I want to make sure that I don't just turn this into a monologue. I really want to engage in this. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free to go ahead and put that in the chat window.
There's nothing in there yet, Dr. Bradley, but yes, y'all go ahead.
All right, perfect. Thank you very much. So we will then just continue to move forward. So then we get to what are some of the biggest knowledge gaps that I've seen in the organizations that I work with, again, not only in North America, but in Europe and as well as Asia. And one of the things we begin to see is One is around strategy. And if we take this thing back, the risk management I've talked about, the lack of alignment we talked about, but the value delivery is another one. Is where is the value in how we deliver care? Well, how is the care we deliver valuable? More so than just ensuring someone is able to live a longer life, what are the other valuable elements of that? Or what's the value of our data that we use in delivery of care? And then performance measurement. How do we measure the success or the quality of our data? And then there's resource management. Who should be responsible for managing and governing the data? Should that fall to my IT team? No, it can't fall to your IT team. They have a role, but their role is typically the role of what we call a custodian, which means their job is to protect the systems where the data is housed, but they are not to be the controlling authority when it comes to data. And so it could be quality, it could be your clinical engineering team, it could be if you have a pathways team, it could be there. If you have a process improvement team, it could be there. It could be within supply chain. It could be a separate center of excellence. But either way, this strategy piece is another one. And then I've already talked about not only do these things pertain to strategy, but these things pertain to governance, which is who has the right to make decisions and who do we hold accountable and how do we hold them accountable to ensuring that we have the desirable behaviors around the way we use data and how we access data. So then that brings us to this part here about what are the sources? And is there a capability for expanding the sources of data that we use? So this was retrieved from the IBM Institute for Business Value. And I believe they did this study, I want to say somewhere around 2016. So it's about 4 years old. But when you look at it, when they began to survey organizations and they were saying, what type of data are you utilizing? And I don't recall how many organizations participated in this, but it was a relatively large because it was a global study. What you begin to find is that they said more than half of them focus on what we call customer generated data and customer generated text. Those two things sound very similar, but they are not the same. For instance, view customer generated data in your world as patient generated data. Now, you might recall that when we started to move out of the talking about meaningful use, and we moved over into MIPS as another incentive program around the utilization of EHRs and other emerging healthcare related technologies, you will remember that there was a clause in there that indicated that hospitals and the systems they utilize have to have the ability to capture what's referred to as patient generated health data, PGHD. Patient-generated health data is data that any patient believes that they want you to have, even if it's not medically relevant to the care that you're providing them. And what it meant is it also had to be data that they were not necessarily advised to monitor by the healthcare provider or the healthcare practitioner. So let's say if it's data from my Bluetooth toothbrush, and I want you to have that and integrate that into your record system, you now have a responsibility for being able to retrieve that. If it's data from one of my health monitors that I use, whether it's my Fitbit, whether it's my Apple Watch, whether it's my whatever that one of the other GPS-based solutions are that we want to monitor, whether it's some type of wearable that I utilize, all of that becomes patient-generated health data. Whether it's from my scale, whether it's data from my gym. All of that is this data. So you could begin to imagine that in that 54%, that's probably not a large percent of what we consider to be life science organizations. We're probably much lower relative to that in terms of how much of that we're utilizing because we didn't necessarily have the mechanism to be able to do that. And so even though we saw more than half in other industries, we saw substantially lower in healthcare organizations. Then we have customer generated or patient generated text. And what this refers to would be any comments that you have gleaned from patients, whether it's comments that they provide on the anonymized and random surveys that we send out to assess patient satisfaction and the patient experience. All of that becomes patient-generated text. We probably utilize that to a higher degree. And when I say utilize it, we capture it. I don't know that we necessarily mobilize it in the way that we should to help us to understand how we can change our practices in our organization, or even try to correlate that with the activities of the various functions, particularly the healthcare team. And what do we need to do, or what can we do better to facilitate that? So one of the things that we're looking at now is organizations with above average supply chain capabilities. How does that impact their HCAP measures? How does that impact their process of care measures? and trying to show that supply chain is more, as I love the way some of my colleagues said, we fill the hands that heal. And so the thing is are we filling it in a manner that's conducive to giving them the ability to respond to patients' need in a timely manner? And then if you look at this, the next highest category was third-party data. This is you going out and buying data from another source or by way of contracts that you have, getting that. So again, this could be data from ECRI, this could be data from your GPOs, this could be data from your suppliers, this could be data from your distributors and your wholesalers. But if you begin to look where we're really low, you begin to see the lowest is around sensors and devices. And I recognize these are in their infancy right now. This is a category that I believe is going to start to increase more and more. You look at social data. Outside of healthcare, a lot of organizations utilize data from social media to help them to understand. And even hospitals now are becoming much more active in a way to engage the communities in which they serve because it helps to inform. And so there is a marketing appeal that begins to happen by way of this. But let me talk about two categories of data that most people don't talk about or think about. And I call these breadcrumbs and then derivative data. And so if you think about these, let's start with derivative data. Derivative data is data in its native form, serves a very specific purpose. But then you begin to realize over time that that data also serves another purpose, or it has another use for it. I'll give you an example of this. Recently, there was a study that was published in Nature. And one of the things that they were studying is the spread or the spreader events around COVID. And we've all seen what we call the shutdown policies. We've seen the slowdown policies, and then we've seen the do absolutely nothing type of policies. And so one of the things they were assessing is which of those policies will really be more effective in curbing not only the spread, but the infectious rate across communities. So what they began to do is they took data that we already knew about, which is called mobility data. Mobility data was data that they was capturing from cell phone use and cell phone interactions, tapping into the GPS components built into cell phones to see how people were moving around from in various states and also at a community level. So this is what I call derivative data, because we've seen this types of thing used. If you guys are familiar with the concept of geofencing, when a person comes within close proximity, or you detect they're within close proximity of a facility by way of the data that's being given from their phone, or the coordinates being provided by the phone, you then ping them and send them some semblance of message. So we've seen that. But now what we've done, we've taken that same type of data and we've derived a different type of use. And so in this, what they were able to do was track people to certain events, certain places, and certain other categories of people. And they were looking at how long were they there. And then they correlate that with public data about what was happening at those places. So you now know they were not at just place X, but you know what event or activity was taking place at place X and how long they were there and how many other people they were exposed to. And then you're able to track each one of these people independently. But what they were also able to do by way of this derivative data is they determined one of the worst policies from an effective standpoint was the shutdown policy. And again, this is not politically motivated, so please understand. They were totally agnostic from a political standpoint with respect to this, because what they were saying is that even if you look in places where there was a shutdown policies, the key was that there were very few and small events that were community related that were the largest spreaders, created the largest infection rate. And then when you track those individuals who were at those smaller events, we're not talking about very large events, smaller events, it was their mobility that was creating the spread. And so what we thought is that the lack of a shutdown or slowdown policy was the issue, but the data does not bear that out. The data suggests that in those areas, and I'll give you an example. Let's take Canada. Canada had a really extreme shutdown policy, to where you were going to stay home, you weren't going to do anything, you could be outside, and you could only go so many kilometers or miles from your house for exercise or to go to the store, or if you had to have some type of emergent medical treatment or medical care. But other than that, they even limited the mobility from province to province, which would be equivalent to state for us. So even with that very egregious policy, or when I say overbearing policy, one of the things you begin to look at, that infection rate didn't necessarily curb in the way that we thought. In fact, their second wave now is larger than their first wave, and the second wave happened even when they were still locked down. So you tell me, How could that policy have been effective? And so that's what this particular study is showing us, is that when we begin to look for derivative data, there are other ways. Now, the other thing that's embedded in that particular story is what I call the breadcrumbs. Some of that data in isolation has little to no meaning. Data about an event that happened in the community, data about a person who's moving about. In isolation, those things may have some value, but not the greatest value. So when we talk about breadcrumbs, we're used to seeing this in a surveillance community, in a security standpoint, where when you're surveilling a person, any little piece of data or information you can get about them, you hold on to it because you never know how valuable it's going to be. And oftentimes the data doesn't prove to be valuable in isolation. It's valuable when you're able to stitch it and connect it to other pieces of data that are also not valuable when they're viewed independently. And so breadcrumbs is about taking individual pieces and fragments of the data you have, putting those together and to say, okay, now what I get is I get a full story with respect to this here. And so this derivative data creates new data sets. It also creates ways in which you can use it. And it could be your own data, but it could be data that you get from a third party. Then you've already talked about how, and I think I really love this analogy where maybe instead of saying data is the new oil, maybe a better analogy is data as the new water. Water, as we know, is a valuable asset, but we also know it's more than just that. It's an essential ingredient to survival. And with respect to it being an essential ingredient to survival, we also understand that data in any form is not good. Data that is, water that is contaminated, water that is polluted is not necessarily an essential ingredient to survival. In fact, it is an input that actually can lead to your demise. And so what we're saying is that if we look at it from a water type of approach or through that lens, what you begin to realize, water needs to be two things. It needs to be accessible and it needs to have the ability to be clean or cleansed. And so when you have that, that is probably a better way to view the data in our organization. And then you begin to connect the data use and the business value. And you begin to see when we start to look at organizations who are doing these are kind of the top 3 metrics that they use relative to assessing the value of data. And it's not about how much data I have or how fast I spend the data. It's about, does the data improve operational efficiency? And not just data in general, but which aspects of data, which data elements in particular drive this, or does it increase revenue for our organization? And if we can't improve revenue, and assuming revenue is flat, or even if revenue is declining, if we can improve operational efficiency, we can still point to how data is making us even more profitable. And when we already have very razor thin profit margins in health systems, and now those are threatened even more because when we had to suspend elective procedures, we've got to be able to look at ways in which data can help us do this here. And so I love this, what we call a data to insights pipeline, where you're going from identifying the data to ultimately looking at not only the business impact, which we consider that to be a second order benefit, but really the most important, which is where you all come in, is a decision-making excellence. Am I able to make better decisions? Am I able to make faster decisions? And do I have more confidence in making the decisions? And can I empower people at lower levels of my organization to be able to make those decisions without having to run things up the flagpole, so that we can make good decisions faster? As someone was asking me the other day, I want to go faster. I said, you can go faster, but it's better to go faster better. And that's what we can get to when we begin to leverage the derived data. Now, in light of this, we all hear we need a single source of truth. We need a single version of truth. And I get it. We all want it. But the reality is not every organization can achieve that. Your organizations have been built on infrastructure that by default creates data and information silos. And in order for you to get to that single source of the truth, you either have to make a decision that you're going to trust one source, and that source, regardless of how many other sources you have, and then oftentimes there's no rhyme or reason as to why you trust that, or you're going to have to be willing to make capital investments to re-architect your IT infrastructure to make sure that you can now integrate the data across the enterprise, which most facilities aren't willing to do that, and many facilities aren't able to do that. So what we have to do then is come to the resolve within ourselves that a single source and a single version of truth, as we truly mean it, may not be plausible for many organizations. So what do we do, Randy, if we can't get there? then I say, let's move past this and let's talk about this. We have multiple sources of truth. And so as a result of these, many organizations, because of the silos that we have relative to our systems, or whether it's also what we call these data lake, not the data lakes, but the proliferation of data, the spread of data across the organization, those things lead us to having what we call data lakes. So we got data lakes, we got data pools, we have data repositories, we have data reservoirs, so forth and so on. But in the end of the day, even data streams, well, here's what we end up with at the end of the day. We end up with what I like to refer to as data swamps. You got a whole bunch of junk in one place, and we're not really sure how to make sense of it. We're not really sure how to process it. We're not sure how to leverage it. We don't even know what it all means. And so what we end up doing is we start turning to what's in the lake, where I like to say pythons are in the lake, particularly if you're down in the Everglades. And then we say, well, we can use these scripting languages to help us extract value, when that is a stopgap. What we have to do is figure out, how do we clean the swamps so that we can get more value from the data. And so when I look around and look at organizations, so here's more than 500 organizations, and this is what I call C.P.I.D.S. And what this is capturing, processing, and integrating data from multiple streams or from multiple sources. And the question was asked, how good is your organization, or do you have a mechanism in place to do this here? And you begin to see that 21% say, I have no idea how good we are. Or they say, we don't even have a formal process for even how to measure how good we are. And then only 16% say that we're good or excellent when it comes to capturing, processing, and integrating data from multiple sources. And yet the vast majority, 63% of over 500 organizations say, Randy, we're at best fair, but more likely we're poor. So even if you take that upper area, 84% are not in a position where we need to be relative to this. So this again makes the case that a single source or single version of truth may not be possible, because as we bring more assets into our organizations, whether they're devices in a patient room, I was looking at a statement yesterday, it was a stat, and one of the things that it mentioned is that there are anywhere from 15 to 25 devices in every patient room on average that is actually connected to your wireless network and disseminating information, meaning they're either pushing or pulling or doing both. So what we're doing is that we're creating more sources and streams of data when we're already challenged with the ones that we have. And so that brings us to this. What do we do with these multiple sources of truth? Well, you can complain about it, or you can figure out how to make good sense of it. When you look at this particular graphic, depending on the angle in that you take, or the way you turn your head, or which eye you use, some of you are going to see 4 of these logs on the screen. Some of you are going to see 3 on here. The question is, which one is right? And does it matter who's right? Does it matter who's wrong? Maybe what we do is, by putting both perspectives together, we get to reality. And so what I propose is that organizations begin to embrace the fact that they have multiple sources of truth. And yes, some of those sources are going to be in conflict, but not everything is going to be in conflict. Some of you might recall this movie from many years ago called Vantage, where you had an event that took place, and yet you had a multitude of people who saw that event, but they all saw that event from a totally different perspective. So they had different vantage points. And so when they were investigating what really happened, the question was it really 8 people telling the story and is only one of them telling the truth? Or could I piece all of these things together to help me understand what the truth is? And so this is what you're going to have to do in your supply chain. Whether you're pulling from your MMIS, whether you're pulling from your ERP, whether you're pulling from your EHR, whether you're pulling from your LIS, your HIS, your PIS, and your RIS, doesn't matter. The point is, all of them give you a vantage point into what's really happening in the organization. And if we take those vantage points and look for points of commonality, we can ultimately get to reality, even if it didn't come from one place. And so what organizations are having to do now, and particularly supply chain organizations, is you've got to determine what your data strategy orientation is going to be. And so let me show you 2 really overarching strategies. You've got what we call a defensive strategy over here, and then you have an offensive strategy. And these 2 strategies do oppose one another. it's common for a healthcare organization to believe that because they're in a heavily compliance and regulated environment, that they have to have a defensive strategy, a defensive mindset. That's not necessarily true. I can see where the natural bent would be there, but you don't necessarily have to allow that to be the perspective. You can still be innovative with respect to how you use data, how you share data, and where you retrieve data. You don't necessarily have to say, I'm only going to have what I need to provide the care we have to provide, and then we're going to lock everything down. That is not going to help you move forward. And then you have the alignment and governance. Alignment and governance in this context are not in opposition to one another. What it's saying is that regardless of your strategy, you're going to need to determine what level of governance is appropriate for your organization. And then how much alignment do I need between my data strategy and the business, digital, and analytic strategy that we're going to devise in our organization. So again, you choose one. And even if you start out as defensive, there's nothing to say that you can't actually move and matriculate into an offensive. So just because you have one orientation doesn't mean you can't change over time. And it's even possible to have different areas within your organization that have totally different approaches to their data strategy. And depending on where they are, it might make sense. So we're running short on time, so I'm going to quickly go past this and relate orienteering. If many of you are familiar with orienteering, you know that involves hiking, racing, and navigating using not only a map, but a compass and several other devices that you would need. The whole point is these tools together help you navigate unfamiliar and diverse terrain. Man, isn't COVID just that? It's unfamiliar. And it seems like every day or every week we hit a new turn. We see something we didn't see. We understand something that we didn't understand. And so not one of these things, whether it's your compass, whether it's your protractor, or whether it's your map, in isolation, they're not enough to help you navigate or be successful. You really need all three. And so they, one, provide directional guide. And so you have to think about from a data literacy. Data literacy is making sure that the people on your supply chain team understand what data is available to them, what that data means, and how that data can be utilized. What are appropriate values for that data, and what values of that data that make absolutely no sense, and they should question it. Data democratization, what we actually refer to here, going back to that multiple versions of the truth. How do you liberate data that's been locked away in PDFs or in images, or data that's been locked away in Excel sheets that are sitting on someone's device that we didn't even know about? All of those things mean we've got to be able to liberate as well as democratize or socialize the data. Then we get into how do we measure our data capability? What's the control over growing the data? The gaps of the visibility to gaps that we have in terms of what are our current state with respect to data needs and what are our future states. And so the blind spots here that I see around data value, or what I refer to as most valuable data. So right now I'm working with about 9 large organizations on this particular question here now, which is what data is valuable to your supply chain? And the thing I love about these 9 companies is they're all in totally different sectors. And yet they're having to come together and say, what is the most valuable data? And then building a hierarchy of that. The other piece is data reliability. Where in our supply network or across our supply chain does the reliability of data or the trust in data begin to attenuate or wane? And we've talked about the governance and the capability to support it. So imagine if this was your organization and you say, you know what? I've now found what data is valuable, and I could measure this by way of its impact on our operations or impact on our decisions. Or I look at the data with respect to the feasibility in which it is to extract or get that data, or the ease with which I can do that. And then I take this map, if you will, this 2-dimensional map, and I begin to lay out where each one of these dots represent a different, not just category of data, but specific data within the category, so that now I can determine what data is most valuable and most impactful to my organization. When I talk about that data reliability, being able to say, as I look at my supply network from a node level, looking at an individual from a hub in terms of how information flows from a single point or that single origin versus across the network, where I know my supply chain interacts with someone else's supply chain and someone else's supply chain, which creates a series of networks. At what point does my data start to attenuate in terms of the credibility and the reliability of that data? And not just at what point, but is it the same point for all types of data? And I'll bypass this thing about having to address the confusion where you see your chief procurement officer or your chief supply chain officer or your director of supply chain in your health systems. You begin to see that what this graphic tells us is that there is a level of uncertainty in terms of who should be the lead and what their responsibility should be around data. As you look at this, and you can see nearly everything is about equal in terms of what they think their role should be around the different aspects of data management and data governance. And so one of the last things we have to do is we've got to change our perspective. If you remember, the CEO of Domino's, Patrick Doyle, once stated, Domino's is a tech company that sells pizza. He said that in 2014. And this was right when they were about 3 years into this transformation of trying to liberate data and realizing how do we move past our multiple sources of truth. And then this one of my favorite by Bernard Marr, who really is an excellent writer in this space around digital and data strategy, says, every business, regardless of its size, is now a data business, which means every business needs a robust data strategy. Let us not continue to use data and have data as the invisible chink in our supply chain armor. Let's recognize it, let's identify it, and let's move forward to address it for the betterment of our patients, because they deserve it. Thank you very much for your time. I will be more than happy to take whatever questions you have as the time remains.